I have kept a ledger every day of my life since I was 9 years old. Rain, weight of the calves, the price of nails, the day my wife stopped breathing, all of it, in the same cramped hand, in books I stack in a crate by the stove. There is one page I never filled in. It's the page for the winter a woman came to the edge of my land and took from me without asking, and left me something in return that I couldn't fit into a column of numbers. She was starving, and she would not say the word help. Not to me. Not to anyone. She would sooner have died in my arroyo with her chin up than let a white rancher see her need. And I have spent the rest of my life trying to understand why that was the bravest and the saddest thing I ever watched a person do. Everybody in that valley looked at her and saw a thief. I was the only one who looked twice. And what I saw the second time is the reason this old man still can't finish that page. Stay with me. This one took me 40 years to be able to tell. The first thing I lost that winter was 3 eggs, and I was ready to shoot a fox over it. That's the truth, and I'm not proud of it. I came out to the coop before light on a morning so cold the latch stuck to my glove, and I counted the hens the way I count everything, pointing at each one, lips moving, and I came up short on the eggs. 3 gone. No feathers, no blood, no broke shells. A fox leaves a mess. A weasel leaves a smell. This left nothing but a clean nest and the print of the coop door swinging where I'd have swore I latched it. I stood there in the blue dark with my breath hanging, and I felt that mean little heat a man gets when something is taken from him. It wasn't the eggs. Lord knows it wasn't the eggs. It was that somebody had been on my ground, close to my house, close enough to touch the walls where I slept, and I hadn't heard a thing. I keep a ledger, I've said that. My father put the first one in my hands when I was a boy and told me a man who writes it down can't lie to himself later, and I have found that to be about the only wisdom of his that held up. So I went back in and I wrote it, 3 eggs, door open. No tracks I could read. And under it, because I am an honest bookkeeper even when it shames me, I wrote, angry over nothing. Because it was nothing. I had 200 head and a full smokehouse, and a wife 3 years in the ground, and no one left to feed but myself. And I was fixing to be furious over 3 eggs. I want you to hold on to that. Remember, I was that man in the beginning. It matters later that I started out small and mean, because I'd like you to believe a person can be turned. I don't have much else to offer you by way of a moral, but I have that. The next thing that went missing was water. I run a trough off the windmill down in the South Flat, and in that cold it skims over with ice by mid-morning. I keep a plank to break it for the cattle. Second week of December I came down and the ice was already broke, not by a hoof, which shatters it every which way, but broke clean along one edge and pushed aside, the way a person does it who means to scoop water and not soak their sleeve. There was a dark patch in the frost where someone had knelt. And there was something on the fence post. It was a little bundle of piñon nuts tied in a twist of grass, set on the post square, deliberate where I couldn't miss it. Now I have thought about that bundle more than I have thought about most of the people I've known my whole life, because a thief doesn't do that. A thief takes and runs and thanks God for the dark. Whoever was taking my eggs and my water was leaving me payment. Piñon for water. And it was the wrong trade. Understand, nobody in their right mind gives up food they've gathered in a hard winter for a few swallows of stock water. Unless the giving of it mattered more to them than the eating of it. Unless they could not stand, could not bear, to be in a stranger's debt. I put the piñon in my coat pocket. I didn't eat it. I wrote in the ledger, water taken. Nuts left in trade. Somebody starving and too proud to steal outright. I underlined too proud. I don't know why. I think part of me already understood, the way you understand a thing before you've got the words for it, the way I understood my wife was dying a week before the doctor would say it out loud. I started leaving food. I told myself it was to catch them. That's what I put in the book, set out biscuit and jerky by trough, we'll watch, but the watching was a lie and I half knew it. I set a tin plate on a flat rock by the trough with 2 biscuits and a strip of dried beef, and I went back to the house and I did not watch. I couldn't have said why. Something in me didn't want to see the face of a person that hungry taking charity off a rock like a stray dog. Maybe I was protecting them from being seen. Maybe I was protecting myself from having to know. In the morning, the plate was there. The food was there too. Untouched, both biscuits, the beef, all of it, sitting on the tin with a rime of frost gone to water and dried again. So I knew it had been out all night and nobody had come near it. Or somebody had come, had stood over it, had looked at that plain and open offering of here. Take this, no shame in it. and had turned and walked away hungry rather than take a thing that was given. But the ice on the trough was broke again. They'd take water they could steal. They would not take food that was offered. I sat down on that flat rock in the cold with the 2 biscuits in my hand, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the fever came through and took Ruth. I felt like I was standing next to somebody's pain, and it was too big for me to touch, and reaching for it would only make it worse, and walking away was a thing I would not be able to live with either. I ate one of the biscuits. It was hard as a hoof. I put the other back on the plate, and I left it there, and I went and did my work. That night the wind came up out of the north like it had a grudge, and I lay in my bed under 3 quilts, and I thought about somebody out in it who wouldn't take a biscuit off a rock. I found her on the shortest day of the year. I remember because I'd noted it in the ledger that morning, the way my father taught me, shortest day, sun turns back after. A little private hope a man keeps in December that the light is coming back even when you can't feel it yet. I'd gone up the arroyo after a heifer that had wandered, and there's an old line shack up there at the head of it, a place my hands hadn't used in 2 summers, half fallen in, the door hanging on one leather. I wasn't thinking about anything but the heifer. I came around the shoulder of the wash and I smelled smoke, thin, careful smoke, a fire built small on purpose, and I stopped my horse and I sat very still. There was a child at the door of the shack. A little one, 4, maybe 5, wrapped in a hide and a piece of trade blanket so worn you could see the weave of the light through it. Barefoot. Bare feet in December, the soles gone gray. The child saw me and did not run and did not cry. Just watched me with a stillness that no child that age should own, the stillness of a young thing that has already learned that noise is dangerous, and I felt the bottom go out of my stomach. Then the woman came out of the shack so fast I never saw her move, and she put herself between me and the child. She had a knife. It wasn't much of a knife, a worn trade blade, the kind you skin with, the point broke off short, but she held it low and easy along her forearm, the way a person holds a knife who has actually used one and is not bluffing. She stood in front of that child and she looked at me with a face that had decided, in the half a second it took her to reach the door, that she was going to die today if she had to, and that it was fine, and that I would not get past her while she was breathing. She was young. Younger than me by a good 10 years, though the cold and the hunger had put age on her that didn't belong there yet. Her hair was cut short and ragged at the jaw. I didn't understand that then. I know now that among her people a woman cuts her hair in grief, and that ragged, jagged cut told me she had lost somebody if I'd only had the sense to read it. Her dress was a cloth dress, not a hide one, and it had been a good dress once, and now it was rags belted with a strip of rawhide, and her face, Lord. Her face was all bone and pride, cheekbones like the ridge of the wash. Eyes that did not blink and did not beg and did not, would not, could not ask me for one single thing. We stood like that a long time. My horse blew and stamped. The child watched from behind her hip. I did the only thing I could think to do, which was to take my hands off the reins slow and hold them open, empty, out to the sides. And I said like a fool, "I ain't gonna hurt you," in English, which I had no reason to think she understood. She didn't move the knife. So I did something my father would have called weakness and my neighbors would have called worse. I got down off the horse slow, everything slow, and I reached into my saddlebag and I took out the parcel I'd packed that morning without letting myself think about why I'd packed so much for one man's noon meal. Cold beef, half a loaf, a twist of salt, some dried apple I'd been saving. I set it on the ground in front of me on a rock in the open and I stepped back to the horse. And she looked at that food and I watched her throat move. And I watched the child behind her look at it too with a naked animal want, and I saw her not take it. I saw it cost her everything not to take it. That's the thing I can't make anybody understand who wasn't there. It would have been so easy for her to be a thief. Thieves have peace in their way, they take and they're gone. What she was doing was harder than stealing and harder than starving. She was standing between her child and food, holding a broke knife, refusing to let a white man see her be grateful. Because being grateful meant being helped, and being helped meant she had lost the last thing she had left, which was the right to look me in the eye as somebody who did not need me. She said something, 2 words low, hard. I didn't know the words, but I knew the tone. The tone was, "Go." I went. I got on my horse and I rode back down the arroyo and I left the food sitting there on the rock, and the whole way down I argued with myself. She'd starve. The child would starve first. Children always do. The fever taught me that they burn small and burn fast. I ought to ride to town and tell somebody. That's what a decent man does. He tells the authorities and lets the authorities handle it. And the authorities put her on a wagon and take her to the reservation down south where her people were supposed to be, where there was supposed to be food and blankets, and an agent paid by the government to see to it. I knew what the reservation was. Everybody knew and everybody pretended not to. I'd heard the freighters talk. I'd heard what the agents did with the rations that were meant for those people. I'd heard about the winters down there and the graves. If I told, I'd be sending that child to die somewhere I couldn't see it. If I didn't tell, I was hiding an Indian on my land in a year when men had been strung up for less. I got back to the house and I sat down at my table and I opened the ledger to write it down, because I write everything down, and I found I couldn't. I sat there with the pen, and the whole day happened again behind my eyes, and I could not put it in a column. There was no column for it. I wrote one line. Found them, woman won't ask, child has no shoes. Then I put the pen down and I put my face in my hands, and I want to tell you I prayed, but I didn't. I hadn't prayed since Ruth. I just sat there in the dark, and I thought about a barefoot child and a mother who'd rather die than say a word. And I understood, sitting there, that whatever I did next was going to change the kind of man I was for the rest of my life, and that there was no version where I got to stay the man who'd been mad about 3 eggs. I went back the next day with shoes. They were Ruth's. That's a thing I'd never told a living soul until now. I'd kept her things, couldn't burn them, couldn't give them away. They sat in a trunk, and I'd open it sometimes just to smell the cedar and pretend. And among them was a pair of her winter moccasins, soft-soled, small, because Ruth had been a small woman. I dug them out and I held them a while, and then I wrapped them in a flour sack, and I rode up the arroyo, and my heart was going like I was courting. The food from the day before was gone. Not scattered, gone, taken careful, and in its place on the rock was a small thing, and when I got down and picked it up, it was a corn cake. Just a little flat cake of ground corn, cooked on a stone. She'd taken my food, finally, when the child's need got past her pride, and she had paid me back. She'd made me a corn cake out of God knows what scraps and set it on the rock so that she would not be in my debt. I ate that corn cake standing there, and it was the best thing I ever put in my mouth, and I have eaten in good hotels since. The shack door was shut. Smoke came thin from the gap in the roof. I didn't go to the door. I'd learned that much. I set the sack with the moccasins on the rock, and I said, loud enough to carry, "For the little one." And I pointed at my own feet like an idiot, so the meaning would cross the gap the words couldn't. Then I made myself do the hard thing. I sat down on a rock 40 feet off, downwind, with my back half to the shack, and I waited, not hiding, letting myself be seen waiting. I don't know what I meant by it. I think I wanted her to know I wasn't going to run to town. I think I wanted to be a fixed thing in her world, a thing that came and left food and did not threaten until the threat wore down. The door opened after a long while. The woman came out. She picked up the sack. She looked inside it, and I watched her go very still. And I understood she knew what moccasins were and knew these had belonged to somebody. And knew, being who she was, reading things the way she read things, that a man does not give away a small woman's shoes unless there is no small woman left to wear them. She looked over at me across the wash. And for the first time, she did not look at me like an enemy. She looked at me like one person looks at another person when they have both buried somebody. Just for a second. Then it was gone, and the pride came back down over her face like a shutter, and she took the moccasins inside to her child and shut the door. But I had seen it. I rode home in the last of the shortest daylight with the sun already gone behind the mountain, and I felt lighter than I'd felt in 3 years, and I did not yet know, how could I, that the hardest part hadn't started, that the valley was small, that a man named Doyle had already noticed I'd been riding up the arroyo 2 days running with my saddlebags heavy, that there were people in that valley who, when they saw a hungry woman and a barefoot child, would never once look twice. I only knew that night that I couldn't finish the page. I sat down with the ledger the way I'd sat down every night of my life, and I meant to account for the day, and I got as far as the date. Then I put the pen down. Some things you can't write in a column, I know that now. Took me a barefoot child to learn it. Doyle came to my place 4 days after Christmas, and he brought 2 other men, and that is how I learned that the hardest thing about helping somebody is not the helping. It's the people who find out. I was forking hay when they rode up. I heard them before I saw them, and I made myself keep forking slow, because I'd learned already that fast movements around suspicion are the same as a confession. Doyle ran cattle on the far side of the ridge, and he had a face like a fist and a way of talking where every friendly word had a hook in it. The other two I half knew, a freighter named Sells, and a young one, barely 20, named Petey Cobb, who followed Doyle around the way a dog follows the man with the meat. "Marsh," Doyle said. "Cold enough for you." "Cold enough," I said, and forked hay. He sat his horse and looked around my place slow, the way a man does when he's counting something. "Heard you been riding up the North Wash, couple times." "Lost a heifer," I said. "Found her," which was even true. "Uh-huh," Doyle chewed on that. Petey Cobb was looking at my saddlebags where they hung on the corral rail, and I'd been careless. There was a corner of flour sack showing where I hadn't packed it away, and I saw the boy see it, and I felt the cold go all through me. "Thing is," Doyle said, "Sells here cut some sign up along the ridge, small feet, bare feet, and a woman's tracks, Injun by the make of the moccasin." He let that hang. "You wouldn't know anything about Injuns campin' up your wash, would you, Marsh?" And here is where I made my morally heavy decision, the one the whole thing turned on, and I want to be honest that I didn't make it out of courage. I made it out of grief. Because in the half-second before I answered, I saw two things. I saw the reservation wagon and the graves the freighters talked about. And I saw Ruth in the bed at the end when the fever had her, and how the one mercy of it was that she died in her own house in my sight held and not shipped off somewhere to die among strangers who'd been paid to bury her cheap. And I thought, I will not send that child to die among strangers, whatever it costs me. I have already watched one person I couldn't save. I will not hand this one to the wagon. "No," I said, "been quiet up there, just me and a dumb heifer." Doyle looked at me a long time. He didn't believe me, I could see he didn't, but disbelief isn't proof, and I was a landowner with 200 head and a good name, and he was a man who suspicioned everybody. "Well," he said finally, "you see any, you send word to town. There's folks won't take kind to Injuns skulkin' round after that business down south last summer. Feelin's is high." He reined around. "Man could get himself in trouble harborin'." They rode off. Petey Cobb looked back once at the flour sack. I stood in the cold a long while after they'd gone. Then I went in and I wrote in the ledger, and this is the entry, I have it still. Lied to Doyle's face. Would do it again. "God keep the boy safe." And I underlined the boy, and then I crossed it out because I didn't know it was a boy. I'd never even learned the child's name, and I sat there ashamed of how little I knew about the two people I'd just risked my neck for. That was the day I decided I had to actually talk to her. Not leave food on a rock. Talk. Because if the valley was going to come looking, leaving parcels wasn't going to be enough. She had to know she was in danger, and to tell her that I had to make her understand me, and to make her understand me, I had to first get her to stop pointing that broke knife at my chest. It took me the better part of 2 weeks. I want to slow down here because those 2 weeks are the part I'd give the most to live again. I went up every day. I stopped putting the food on the rock and walking off. I started staying. I'd sit at my 40 feet and I'd whittle because a man whittling looks like a man with nowhere to be and no harm in him, and I'm a poor whittler and I made a lot of shavings and no useful thing. The child came out first, the way children do, curiosity beating fear. A boy I'd figured by then. He'd stand at the door in Ruth's moccasins. They were big on him and he'd stuffed them with grass. I could see the grass poking out, and something about that grass about killed me, and he'd watch me whittle. One day I whittled a little horse. A bad little horse, humpbacked, one leg shorter. I set it on the rock and went back to my 40 feet. The boy came out and got it and took it inside, and a while later he was back at the door and he was playing. Walking the bad little horse along the doorsill, making a small sound with his mouth that I understood, across all that distance and all that difference, to be the sound a boy makes for a galloping horse. It's the same in every language. I found that out on the coldest ground of my life. The woman let it happen. That was her allowing it. She stood in the door with her arms crossed, and she watched her boy play with a white man's whittling, and she did not stop it. And I understood that was as much of a thank you as she had left in her to give, and that it had cost her, and I did not make her pay more for it by looking pleased. Slowly then, she came out and sat in the door and mended a hide while I whittled. We didn't speak. There was nothing to speak with. But one afternoon I pointed at myself and said my name, Eli. And she looked at me, and after a while she pointed at herself and said a word. I won't try to spell it the way it truly sounded. I'd get it wrong, and I've gotten enough wrong. But she said it slow a second time so I could have it. And then she pointed at the mountain, at the high place where the snow was, and she made a shape with her hand like water coming down. And I understood. Or I made myself a story that let me understand. That her name had to do with the high water, the snowmelt, the thing that comes down off the mountain in spring and makes the whole dry country live for a while. I called her that in my head ever after. Snowmelt. It's not her name. I never had her true name in a way I could keep. But it's what I called the space where she was, and it fit her better than she'd have liked, because she was exactly that, a hard, cold thing off a high place that everything downstream depended on and nobody thanked. The boy she called by a name I could say, and I won't put it here either, but I said it to him, and he laughed the first time I got it near right, laughed like any boy, and Snowmelt looked at me over his head with a look I'm not able to describe. I'll just say I'd been 3 years without anybody looking at me like I was worth the trouble of a look, and it landed on me like the first warm day. I learned her story in pieces, over those 2 weeks, in signs and the few words we could trade, and a great deal of guessing that she'd correct with her hands when I got it wrong. I'll give it to you plain the way I finally understood it, though understand it came to me broken and out of order, the way the truth usually does. Her band had been small, up in the high country, keeping out of the way, doing nobody harm. In the summer there'd been that business down south Doyle mentioned, some other band, some raid, some killing. It didn't matter that it wasn't her people. The soldiers didn't sort them out. Writers had come. Her husband, the ragged cut hair, the grief, I had it right. Her husband had stayed at the mouth of their camp so the others could get up the rocks, and he had not come up the rocks after them. She made the sign for that very simply. She put her hand flat and then turned it over. That was all. That was her husband. They'd scattered. She'd gotten away with the boy and 2 others, an old woman and a girl, and the old woman had died in the first snow, and the girl, she made a sign I didn't want to understand, and so I made her do it twice, and I understood it, and I wished I hadn't. The girl had been taken, not killed, taken by men. Snowmelt had the boy, and she had run, and she had kept running, and running had brought her. In the end, down out of the high country she knew and onto the low ground of a stranger, to a fallen-in shack on the land of a white rancher, where she was reduced to breaking his ice for water and hiding her son's bare feet, and refusing to say the word that would have made any of it easier. Because here's the thing I finally understood about the shame, sitting on that cold ground. It wasn't pride. I'd called it pride in my ledger, and I'd been wrong. Pride is a small thing, a vanity, a thing you can talk a person out of. What Snowmelted wasn't pride. It was the last wall of a person who has had every other thing taken. They'd taken her husband and her home and her people and the girl and the whole country she knew how to live in. The one thing they had not taken, the one thing left that was hers, was the right to not need them, to not need us. And if she asked me for help, if she said the word, if she let herself be the thing the valley already thought she was, a beggar, an Indian with her hand out, then she'd have handed over that last thing too, and she'd have had nothing left at all. She wasn't being proud. She was holding the door on the last room in the house. And I'd been standing on the other side of it for 2 weeks like a fool with a plate of biscuits, saying, let me in, and never once understanding that the kindest thing I could do was stop asking her to open it. So I stopped asking. I started instead doing a thing that I have never been able to explain to anybody without them looking at me funny. I started making it so that she was helping me. I brought a hide-up that needed scraping, and I made a great show of not being able to do it, and I left it. And she scraped it better than any man of mine ever had, and I paid her in flour in front of the boy like a wage. I brought a shirt of mine that wanted mending. I brought a snare that wouldn't set right, and she fixed it with her hands in about 4 seconds and gave me a look like I was the dumbest creature God had made. And I laughed, out loud, for the first time in 3 years, right there in the snow. And after a second, she almost did too. I made her a person who was owed, not a person who was given to. It's the same food crossing the same 40 feet of frozen ground, but it is not the same thing at all. And if you've ever been the one on the receiving end of a kindness you couldn't pay back, you know exactly the difference I'm talking about, and you know which one lets you sleep at night. I wrote it in the ledger like it was true, because I'd decided it would be true. Oh, Snowmelt for 2 hides scraped, 1 shirt, snare. Paid in flour, salt, will owe wages come spring. Come spring. I'd written come spring like there was going to be one where we were all still there. There wasn't, but I didn't know that yet. The setback came with the second big snow in the middle of January, and it came the way trouble always comes, through the thing you love, not the thing you fear. The boy took sick. I came up through snow to my horse's knees, and I knew before I got to the shack. I knew from the smoke being wrong, too much of it. a fire built high and desperate, and I knew from the sound. He was coughing. That deep, wet bark that I had heard before in my own house from my own wife, the sound that starts in a place too low in the chest, and I got down off my horse, and for the first time in a month I went straight to the door without waiting to be let, and Snowmelt did not stop me. That's how I knew how bad it was. She let me in. The boy was on the hides by the fire, and he was burning up. Little face gone dark and shining with it, breath going fast and shallow and catching on that cough. And Snowmelt was kneeling over him with her hands not knowing what to do with themselves, and she looked up at me, and I have to stop a second. She looked up at me and her face was not a wall anymore. The wall was gone. Every bit of the pride and the distance and the 2 weeks of hard-won careful, all of it gone, burned off by the fear, and what was underneath was just a mother watching her child breathe wrong. And she looked at me, a white rancher and enemy's kin, a stranger she'd held a knife on, and she opened her mouth. And I watched her fight it. I watched her whole body fight it, because she knew what came next was the thing she'd sworn she would die before she did. And then she did it anyway. She said a word in English, one word. The only English word I ever heard her say, and I have no idea where she'd learned it, off a freighter maybe, off a trader years back, I'll never know. She looked at me over her dying son and she said it. Please. I'm going to leave part 2 there on that word, because that's where it lives in me and I can't move it. She spent everything she had left to say it, and I have spent 40 years trying to be worth having been the one she said it to. The snow was still coming down, the boy was burning, and Doyle and his men were 3 miles off across the ridge, and a track in fresh snow can be followed by a child. And I had a sick Indian boy in a shack on my land, and a mother who had just asked me, in the one word she had, to do the one thing I had already failed once in my life to do. Save somebody. You cannot move a boy that's sick through snow that deep, and you cannot leave him in a fallen-in shack with a hole in the roof, and you cannot bring him down to your house where the first man who rides up will see an Indian child in a white man's bed, and have you both hung by Thursday. I stood in that shack with the word please still hanging in the smoke, and I ran every one of those walls at once and bounced off every one of them. And then I stopped thinking like a scared man and started thinking like a rancher, which is to say a man whose whole life is doing the impossible thing to the animal in front of him, because there's no one else and it has to be done. The soddy, I said out loud, though she couldn't understand it. The old soddy. There's a soddy dug into the hill behind my house from the first year before I built the frame house, half dugout, half sod, a low, warm, dark hole in the ground with a good stove in it that I'd used for a smokehouse since. Warm, hidden. Backed into the hill so its smoke came out low and scattered along the slope and didn't stand up like a flag. A man could keep somebody in that soddy through a whole winter, and the road never know. I got them down there that night, and I'm not going to pretend it was anything but terrible. I carried the boy inside my own coat against my chest, the way you carry a chilled calf, and he burned against me the whole way and coughed that low cough into my collarbone, and Snowmelt walked in my tracks with the hides and the fire things bundled on her back. And the snow came down and covered our trail behind us as fast as we made it, which was the one mercy God saw fit to send that night, and I'll take it. I put them in the soddy, I built the stove up, and then I did the thing I knew how to do, the thing I had done for Ruth and failed, and I did it again anyway, because sometimes all you've got is to do the thing that failed you and pray it fails you different this time. I steamed him, water on the stove, a blanket over his head to catch it, honey and whiskey down his throat a spoon at a time. I had Snowmelt hold him upright against her so the fluid wouldn't drown him lying flat. I couldn't tell her that in words. I showed her with my hands and she understood in an instant. She understood everything with her hands faster than I could say it. And we traded off, the two of us, all that night and the next day and the next night. And I did not go to town, and I did not do my stock right, and 2 heifers I'd have saved in a good week died in the far pasture. And I wrote them off in the ledger without a second thought, which if you knew the man I'd been in November would tell you everything about the man I'd become by January. On the 3rd night the fever broke. I've seen it break and I've seen it not, and there's no mistaking the break when it comes. The boy had been somewhere far off, somewhere hot and lost, muttering in his own tongue to people who weren't there, to his father I think some of it from the way Snowmelt's face went when he said certain words. And then along about the black middle of the 3rd night he went quiet, and I thought we'd lost him. I truly did. My heart stopped dead. And then he sighed. A long, ordinary, tired little sigh. And the sweat came all at once, soaking him, which is the body letting go of the fire, and his breath went long and even, and he slept. Real sleep. Boys sleep. Snowmelt put her hand flat on his chest and felt it rise and fall, and then she bent over him with her rag-cut hair falling down, and she made a sound I'd never heard her make, low and broken, and I turned my face away and looked hard at the stove and gave her that. Gave her the one thing I had left to give, which was to not watch her while she came apart with the relief of it. When I looked back, she had herself in hand again, but she looked at me across the sleeping boy, and she reached out slow, the way you'd reach for a horse that spooks, and she put her hand on the back of my hand where it rested on my knee, just for a second. Her hand was rough as mine and warm from the boy's fever. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything. She took her hand back. I wrote it in the ledger the next morning, and it's the shortest, true thing I ever wrote in 50 years of keeping books. Boy lived. She touched my hand. I am not the same. They stayed in the soddy through the worst of the winter, and it was, I'll tell you plainly, the best season of my life, and I've had some good ones since, and I'm not taking it back. We were careful. Lord, we were careful. She never came up to the house in daylight. The boy, his name I'll finally give you, or the sound I made of it, Sue, near enough. The boy got strong again fast the way children do, and by February he was underfoot everywhere in that soddy, and he'd taken to me in the whole way a child takes to a thing, which is completely and without any of the reservation the grown carry, and he'd ride the fence line with me in the gray before dawn tucked in front of my saddle with my coat around him, and he learned my English words faster than I learned his. And he corrected my whittling with great scorn, and I taught him his letters in the dirt with a stick, and I would have died for him inside of a month and been glad. Snowmelt and I found a way to be, in that season, that I don't have a word for. It wasn't courting, though I'd be a liar if I said I didn't feel it try to be some nights by the stove. It was two people who'd both been broke by the same kind of loss, in the same country, on opposite sides of a thing neither of us made, finding out that the loss was the same shape underneath no matter which side you took it from. She'd lost her man to my kind. I'd lost my woman to a fever that didn't care what kind anybody was. And in the low, warm dark of that soddy, those two losses would sit down across the stove from each other of an evening and just be. Two griefs keeping each other company. It was the least lonely I have ever been. I started, God help me, to think about spring in a way I hadn't let myself. I thought the far quarter, the piece down by the creek nobody ever rides past, I could put a cabin there. I could say I'd hired on a woman to cook and her boy to run errands. People did that half Mexican, half anything. Nobody looked too hard at a hired hand. I could keep them. I let myself think it. I wrote figures in the back of the ledger. Lumber, nails, a stove. I should have known better. A man my age who'd buried a wife ought to have known by then that the world does not let you keep the thing you make a home for. But hope is a fool and it doesn't learn, and I don't guess I'd want it to. The riders came in March. On a morning the snow was rotting off the south slopes, and you could smell under the cold the first far-off green of the thaw. 6 of them. Not Doyle, worse than Doyle. Soldiers, 2 of them, and 4 civilians riding along the way civilians do when there's an Indian to be caught and it's legal. And Petey Cobb was one of the 4, the boy, Doyle's dog, and he wouldn't look at me. And that's how I knew who'd talked. He'd seen the flour sack in December, and he'd carried it around in him all winter, and finally it had come out. They didn't come to my house. They rode straight for the soddy. Somebody had told them exactly where, and the only bodies that could have walked that trail enough to beat it in were mine and Snowmelt's and a boy's, so I never did work out how, a hunter maybe, in February, some track we missed. It doesn't matter. They rode straight for the soddy, and I came out of the barn at a dead run with no plan on God's earth, and no gun in my hand, and nothing, but the certainty that I was about to watch it happen again. Watch them take somebody out of my sight to die. And here is the last thing, the thing I have never told, the reason I could never finish the page. Snowmelt came out of the soddy before they reached it. She came out with the boy's hand in hers, and she dressed him in the good moccasins and wrapped him warm, and she'd done something to herself, stood herself up, put the wall back up, the whole wall, higher than I'd ever seen it. And she walked out to meet those 6 armed men across the melting snow with her chin up like a queen going to something she'd chosen. And I understood, running too far to reach her, I understood what she'd done and why. She'd decided. She'd done the figuring faster and colder than I ever could. She knew if they took her and the boy off my land, and I was standing there having hidden them, They'd hang me or burn me out and put the boy on the wagon anyway, and it'd all be for nothing. 2 dead and a child gone and my whole life ash. But if she walked out to meet them like she'd been making her own way, like she'd wandered onto my land and I'd never known, if she gave them the surrender they'd come for cleanly, with the boy, then they'd take the 2 of them and they'd have no reason to touch me at all. She was spending herself to buy me clear. The proudest woman I ever knew, who would not say help to save her own life, walked out and surrendered to save mine. She looked back at me once, just once across all that ground with the soldiers already closing on her, and she didn't make the sign for water or for the boy or any of the signs we'd built between us all winter. She made a different one. She put her hand flat over her own chest, over her heart, and then she turned it and opened it toward me, the way she'd once turned her hand over to tell me her husband was dead. Except turned the other way, opening, giving. And I have spent 40 years deciding what it meant, and I've decided it means the only thing it can mean, and I won't cheapen it by writing the word. Then they took them. The boy fought, Sue fought, screamed, reached back for me over a soldier's arm, screaming the near-right sound of my name that I'd taught him laughing in the snow. And they put the 2 of them on a led horse and they turned south. And Petey Cobb rode drag and never once raised his eyes. And I stood in the rotting snow in front of my empty soddy, and I did not fall down, and I did not shout, and I did not go for a gun. Because she had spent everything she had to buy me my life, and the one way left to honor it was to keep the life she'd bought. So I stood there. I stood there until they were gone over the south ridge, and the sound of the boy was gone, and there was nothing but snowmelt running in the ditches. That first spring water coming down off the high country, going where it had to go, feeding a valley that would never thank it. I looked for them, understand that. I'm not a man who just stood in a field. I rode south inside the week, and I asked at the agency, and they told me a lie with a straight face, and I knew it was a lie. And I asked at 3 more places and got 3 more lies. And I hired a man once, a year on, who spoke the tongue, to go among the people down there and ask after a woman off the high country and her boy Sue. And he came back and would not take my money and would not meet my eye. And that was its own kind of answer, and I have carried it. I never found them. I want to lie to you here at the end and give you the thing you want, the thing I want, the boy groaned, riding back up my wash some autumn, a young man, the whittled horse still in his pack. I've written that ending in my head 10,000 times. It didn't happen. The truth is I don't know. The truth is the country is very big, and it swallowed them the way it swallowed a lot of people it should be ashamed of. And I was a small rancher with a good name and no power. And I did everything a small man could do, and it wasn't anything. But I'll tell you what I've got. It's not much, and it's all I've got, and I've made my peace that it has to be enough. I've got a corn cake I ate standing up on a rock, the best thing I ever tasted, made by a starving woman who would not be in my debt. I've got a boy's grass-stuffed moccasins, galloping a bad little horse along a doorsill in the coldest December of my life. I've got a hand, rough and fever-warm, laid on the back of mine for 1 second across a sleeping child. I've got the one English word she ever said to me, and the whole terrible weight of what it cost her to say it, and the knowing, the only thing I know for certain out of all of it, that when she finally asked for help, she was not asking for herself. And I've got a page in a ledger, dated the shortest day of a year 40 winters gone, with 1 line under the date, and the rest of it blank, and blank it's going to stay, because I have tried and I cannot account for her. There's no column. There was never a column. I've kept books my whole life to keep from lying to myself, and this is the one true thing they could never hold. She was ashamed to ask for help,